Christianity and Nationality by Vadim Borisov. But here we come up against the inspired objection of the Apostle Paul. There is neither Jew nor Greek. Many who quote this objection, including I. Krasnov Levitin in number 106 of the Vestnik RSKD, though there are few enough who don't quote it, regard it as so authoritative, incontrovertible, and altogether crushing as to eliminate the entire question of relations between the human personality and the nation from the Christian point of view, as if it were not a question at all, or, at any rate, one long ago answered. For Christianity, the human personality exists, the nation does not. We do not propose to quibble with St. Paul, still less to dispute his authority, for he did write those words, but they did have a continuation which, for some reason, is invariably overlooked by the proponents of Christian universalism, or, to run a little ahead, pseudo-universalism, neither male nor female. Are its proponents bold enough to maintain that Christianity, with its teachings on marriage, makes no distinction between the sexes? Did not the apostle to the heathen rather mean that there is no difference between Greek and Jew, man and woman, slave and free man, in one particular respect? He said so quite explicitly elsewhere. For the Scripture saith, Whosoever believeth on him shall not be ashamed, for there is no difference between the Jew and the Greek, for the same Lord over all. Romans 10, verses 11 and 12. To take the scriptural argument further, have all universalists ever stopped to consider texts like, All nations whom thou hast made? Psalm 86, verse 9. Do they remember that Christ brought the good news, not to scattered individuals, but to the people of Israel as a whole? Or Christ's words, Go ye therefore and teach all nations. And does this not mean, despite all their disclaimers, that the nation problem does exist for Christianity, and that attempts to discard it or even morally destroy it on the basis of half a dozen imperfectly understood words are, to say the least, unjustified and premature? In our atheist age, however, even Christians tend to shy away from scriptural arguments. This obliges us to transpose the question into a somewhat, if not altogether, different plane. What is a nation? What is the essence of this mysterious human community at which universalists of various kinds have chanted spells, abracadabra, vanish, for a century and more, but which has obstinately refused to vanish? Is it common territory, a common economy, language, kinship, or all of them taken together, or perhaps something else altogether? Dostoevsky's notebook contains the following words: The nation is nothing more than the national personality. He returned to this idea many times. It was one of his most intimate and penetrating thoughts. He understood the national personality not metaphorically, not in the abstract, but precisely as a living personal unity. He saw it as the spiritual reality that binds all the concrete, historical, and empirical manifestations of national life into a single whole. Well, they will say, Dostoevsky was a mystic and is not much in demand these days. But a nation is not a collection of different beings. It is an organized being, and moreover, a moral personality. A wonderful secret has been revealed: the great soul of France. The author of these words was no mystic. It was the famous historian of the French Revolution, Michelet. Rather than weary the reader with quotations, we ask him to take our word for it, that the same idea, although not always equally well defined, appears in many spiritually sensitive people of all ages and all nations, however different their personal philosophies. Just one more quotation, then, a very characteristic one from A. Herzen, the great writer and little understood idol of the Russian intelligentsia, to whom the mystery of the nation as a personality was a matter of deep concern. It seems to me, he wrote, that there is something in Russian life higher than the community and stronger than the might of the state. It is hard to capture in words, harder still to point to with the finger. I mean that inner, not quite conscious power which wondrously preserved the Russian people under the yoke of the Mongol hordes and the German bureaucracy, under the Tartar knout from the east and the corporal's staves from the west, that inner power which preserved the attractive open character and lively wit of our peasants under the humiliating oppression of serfdom, and which, when commanded by the Tsar to educate itself, within 100 years replied with the resounding phenomenon of Pushkin. I mean, finally, that power of self-confidence which lives on in our breasts. This constant power has preserved the Russian people and its unwavering faith in itself, preserved it outside all forms and against all forms. This sense of the nation as a personality, which has been expressed by individuals, corresponds with and confirms the people's awareness of its identity as embodied in folklore. Its image covertly governs our speech, for when we speak of the dignity of the people, its duty, its sins, or its responsibility, we are making concrete, that is to say, unmetaphorical use of terms that are applicable only to the moral life of a person. Finally, the unfathomable mystery of the nation's ultimate destiny. Here again, we shall have to resort to the Holy Scriptures. The mystery of its indestructibility and autonomy, unbounded by space and time, in other words, the secret of its metaphysical essence, is revealed in the Apocalypse. And the nations of them which are saved shall walk in the light of it, the city of God, and they shall bring the glory and honor of the nations into it. Revelation 21, verses 24 and 26. And, says St. John the Divine, the disciple whom Jesus loved, this shall come to pass after the first heaven and the first earth have passed away. This concept of the nation as a person cannot be completely translated into the language of reason, and therefore remains altogether foreign to rationalism and positivism, not to mention materialism. That is, specifically the philosophies, since there are, of course, exceptions among their adherents. However, even those endowed with neither a religious outlook on life nor any special spiritual sensitivity can, to a certain extent, verify the reality of the nation's personality as distinct from the empirical manifestations of national life. All that is required is to examine with care and without prejudice, not necessarily to live through at first hand, the experiences of the Russian immigration throughout the last century or so. Many Russians have shaken the dust of the hated and despotic fatherland off their feet, cursing and denouncing its monstrous face, and fled to Europe, the land of sacred miracles, to liberty, equality, and fraternity. But very soon, quite against their expectations and desires, these same Russians were overcome by a spontaneous sense of some irreparable loss. The trouble, as many of them understood, was not simply the result of an unfamiliar environment or a foreign language. Most of them, after all, knew European languages and European conditions, just as well as their own. But something else. They gradually came to see the land of sacred miracles as an abomination of desolation, and their own existence in it, though often quite comfortable, as illusory and insubstantial. And, unexpectedly, the bond with the motherland, this darkness unmasked, to use Marina Zvetayeva's phrase, came to be the only thing that mattered, with a direct bearing on the very essence of their being. They came to realize that behind the outward appearances of the life of their people, they had failed to perceive what was most important, the essence of which Herzen wrote. They had not suspected it before, and only now, in their isolation, could they begin to divine its real meaning and understand Russia as a personality, to whom their own personalities were by some mysterious process indissolubly bound. In their dark homeland, these people suddenly perceived a fount of light, and were drawn to it irresistibly, even when inevitable destruction stared them in the face. This is the secret of the spiritual nature of that famous and mysterious Russian nostalgia, the unaccountable feeling of having lost some whole whose lack makes man's life seem incomplete. Slavophiles and Westernizers alike were stricken with it, positivists and mystics, Russian Orthodox and Russian Catholics. It led them to mental instability and often to irretrievable breakdown. Russia continues to haunt her outcasts and fugitives all their lives. It is not the immensity of her plains, nor the beauty of her little birch trees, which have now become something of a joke, nor even any peculiar trait of the Russian soul, but she herself, her mysterious face, which evidently possesses such fascination. And it is perhaps because rationalism and materialism held such comparatively short sway in Russia that this emotion is so extraordinarily acute among Russian immigrants, demonstrating that their spiritual capacity to be aware of their participation in the whole has not altogether atrophied, and that they are actively conscious of the inclusion of their individual personalities in a more complex unity, the collective, or to use the traditional term of Russian thought, corporate national personality. That is what we call the nation. We have already said that personality, in its original sense, is a specifically Christian concept. It was unknown to the ancient world, whose consciousness was totally individualistic. The Greeks, for instance, despised all barbarians, and the citizens of Rome despised all non-Romans. We have forgotten the Christian origins of our idea of the personal as of something that gives every individual his qualities of absoluteness, unrepeatability, and irreducibility to other individuals, and this insensibility threatens ultimately to render meaningless the words we all so willingly use. We often confuse the concepts of personality and individual in our speech and use them as if they were synonymous, but in Christian thought they are poles apart. This requires some explanation. In Christian thought, the world is not simply the arithmetical sum of its visible parts, but a definite hierarchy, all of whose levels are personalized. This applies even to the structure of the life of the deity, whose mystery is embodied in the triune dogma of the three persons of the one God, and it applies equally to the structure of the life of mankind, inasmuch as Christianity, in the words of St. Gregory of Nyssa, is an imitation of the nature of God. Christian ideology distinguishes in God a single nature and its existence in persons, or personalities. The same distinction lies at the heart of all Christian anthropology, and may, in our view, also be applicable to the question of the true role and significance of the nation as personality in mankind. The source of the Christian interpretation of this question in the two great historical events, the Incarnation and the Pentecost. In Christ's time, there were many peoples already existing on earth, occupying various territories, speaking various languages, and warring with one another. Was their appearance merely a historical accident? The words of the Bible about the nations thou hast made answer this question in the negative. The existence of peoples was part of the plan of creation, forming part of God's design for the world. In the course of their history, however, the peoples had lost their common measure, which Christ then restored to them. Having assumed the perfect nature of man in the Incarnation, Christ forever confirmed the natural unity of mankind, once enshrined in the person of the first man, old Adam. But Christ did not come to do away with the design of the Creator. He did not become the flesh of history so as to abolish it, but in order to become its spiritual center, its course of energy, and its purpose. Man's nature is one, says Christianity, but all nature is contained in somebody's personality and can have no other existence. In other words, Christianity introduced to the world the concept of the plurality of personalities of a single mankind. Personalities not just individual, but also national. This concept, in particular, is symbolized in the events of the Pentecost, when the Holy Ghost descended on the apostles, and they were endowed with the gift of speaking in different tongues. And they were all amazed and marveled, saying to one another, Behold, are not all these which speak Galileans? And how hear we every man in our own tongue, wherein we were born? Parthians and Medes and Elamites, and the dwellers in Mesopotamia, and in Judea, and Cappadocia, and Pontus, and Asia, Phrygia, and Pamphylia, in Egypt, and in the parts of Libya around Cyrene, and strangers of Rome, Jews and proselytes, Cretes and Arabians. We do hear them speak in our tongues the wonderful works of God. The Christian church was born not in a single world language, but in the different tongues of the apostles, reaffirming the plurality of national paths to a single goal. We can now easily understand the Christian view of the difference between the personality and the individual, and the new principle contributed to the so-called national question by the concept of the nation as personality. The individual embodies the opposite of the common measure in mankind, a fragment of the one human nature, self-sufficient and absolute, consisting of uniform particles formed from a mingling of nature and personality. Individual men and individual nations are impenetrable to one another. The personality, as opposed to the individual, is not a part of some whole. It comprehends the whole within itself. The personality is not a fragment of one nature, but embraces the whole fullness of nature. Therefore, the idea of personality presupposes the existence of a common measure in mankind. To the contemporary mind, these meditations may indeed, probably do, seem exceedingly abstract and divorced from the alarming reality of today. But we shall soon see the practical consequences that follow from forgetting and distorting these Christian ideas. If the nation is a corporate personality endowed with its being by God, then it cannot be defined as a historical community of people or a force of nature and history. Vladimir Solovyev. The nation is a level in the hierarchy of the Christian cosmos, a part of God's immutable purpose. Nations are not created by a people's history. Rather, the nation's personality realizes itself through that history. Or, to put it another way, the people in their history fulfill God's design for them. In this sense, the nation is distinct from the empirical people. The history of a people chronicles its discovery of its own personality. There is no concrete moment in the life of a people that fails to manifest its personality, and conversely, no historical situation is capable of plumbing the full depths of its personality. Different stages of its self-discovery may come into sharp conflict with one another, as happens to the individual life of a man. This can lead to terrible declines, but so long as the people remains aware of its personal unity, and therefore of its freedom, it can reemerge from even the deepest gulfs. The acknowledgement by all members of a national unit of their personal unity is what we call national consciousness. It brings together all aspects and empirical manifestations of a nation's historical being. Its aim, in the words of Vladimir Solovyev, is to achieve in its destiny and spirit of the people what God thinks of it in eternity. A necessary precondition of the people's existence and development is historical memory. If this is destroyed, the people's self awareness suffers pathological distortion. It comes to identify its personality to its own detriment with the present moment of its existence. It forgets that all empirical personality is imperfect and that the fulfillment of personal life can only be achieved by a continuous and conscious process of development. The destruction of historical memory kills a people's spiritual yearning for its fulfillment, cripples its moral personality, undermines its faith in the possibility of the creative conquest of evil and its hope of rebirth. If peoples are recognized as personalities, this leads to recognition of their equality, giving them all an indisputable right to be respected and loved by all others, affirming the absolute value of their national identity. But how can the freedom of the individual human personality be reconciled with its membership in a national whole? No man is born into the world as a creature without personality, a clean slate. If he is to exercise free self determination in his earthly life, he must already be, at the moment of his birth, a qualitatively, and therefore also nationally, defined person. This definition is admittedly only an ideal and potential one, a metaphysical foundation for our spiritual nature. It does not violate or diminish the gift of human freedom. Every person is free to evade the fulfillment of his personal destiny, free to reject God's design for him, to forget the roots of his being, but destroy these roots completely he cannot. And whatever new characteristics a man may acquire in the ups and downs of his life, his innermost being and subconscious self always preserve some vague ideas of his origins, of his prototype. In many people, this tends to come to the surface as an oppressive, restless dissatisfaction with life, a sense of some unfulfilled vocation. But another way is always open to every human personality, the way of self-knowledge, plumbing the depths of one's own self and the spiritual source of one's being. On this path towards God, a sense of national awareness sooner or later comes into its own, an awareness of the individual's metaphysical relationship with the corporate self of the people, and through it, with the corporate self of mankind. But all these correlations can be considered to be no more than the theoretical base of Christian consciousness. Real life is still very far from realizing them. As in the time of the early Christians, they only show the way by which mankind may achieve the fulfillment of personal existence. In Christian terms, this higher level of personal being is called the Church. Mankind, as the Church, is the fulfillment of the future, toward which the constantly changing reality of the existing world must strive, so as to become one with its Creator. But every personality, individual or national, being unique, approaches this union in its own way, striving to achieve fulfillment within itself. Only thus is the true whole fulfilled. Christianity does not ask mankind to deny the variety of the personalities composing it, nor to become an amorphous mass. It urges mankind to transform itself entirely unto the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. Ephesians 4, verse 13. Every people, every individual person, must achieve his fulfillment in the Church. When this comes to pass, when all nations have achieved this goal, this will be the perfect fulfillment of the corporate personality of mankind, Christ's Church, in which the nations' spiritual existence, their glory and honor, will be laid at Christ's feet. All nations whom thou hast made shall come and worship before thee, O Lord, and shall glorify thy name. This is mankind's free and common purpose.